I never expected something like this to exist. Not because I don't believe in connection, not because I think people can't understand each other, but because I've always believed that the deepest parts of a person are built behind walls that take years to reach. People spend a lifetime trying to be seen. They explain themselves. They reveal pieces slowly. They offer small windows into who they are and hope someone notices what's beyond them. But most people don't. Most people only recognize what they are shown. They understand the words, but not the silence behind them. They notice the actions, but not the reasons. They see the expression, but not the thoughts that created it. That has always been the difference. Being around people is easy. Being understood is rare. And somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting anyone to reach the places I kept hidden. Not because I didn't want to be understood, because I learned that being misunderstood is easier to manage than being misunderstood after being fully seen. There's a certain safety in distance. Distance keeps things simple. It allows people to know just enough to interact without touching the parts that are difficult to explain. I became comfortable there, in that space where I could exist without constantly translating myself, where I didn't have to prove why I think the way I think, why certain things matter to me, why silence sometimes says more than words ever could. Most people want explanations. They want everything organized into categories. They want a reason behind every reaction. But some things don't work that way. Some things are felt before they are understood. And that is exactly what happened with you. There was no dramatic beginning, no obvious moment where everything changed, no single conversation that created this. It was smaller than that, almost invisible. A collection of moments, a pattern, the kind of pattern you don't notice until you realize it has already been forming for a long time. It was in the way you listened, not just waiting for your turn to speak, actually listening. There is a difference. Most people listen to respond. You listened to understand. And that difference changed everything. Because for once, I didn't feel like I had to prepare myself before being seen. I didn't have to edit every thought. I didn't have to make myself easier to understand. I could just exist. And somehow, that was enough. That feeling is difficult to explain because it wasn't excitement. It wasn't some overwhelming moment that takes over everything. It was something quieter, something more unusual. It felt like recognition, like meeting someone and realizing the conversation started long before either person said anything. Like there was an understanding that existed before the explanation. And that's what made it different, because I'm used to people trying to discover me, trying to solve me, trying to find the answer to who I am, but you never treated me like a puzzle. You never approached me like something that needed to be figured out. You simply paid attention. And somehow that was more powerful than any attempt to understand, because when someone tries to solve you, they are usually searching for their own version of the answer. But when someone truly observes you, they allow you to remain yourself. You did that. You left room for me to be exactly what I was. And that kind of acceptance is rare. Not the kind where someone ignores your flaws, the kind where someone sees the complexity and doesn't immediately try to change it. That's what stayed with me. The fact that you didn't rush, you didn't demand access, you didn't try to force closeness. You just remained present. And somehow, presence became the thing that created the strongest connection. That's what I didn't expect. I thought connection was built through time, through memories, through shared experiences, through countless conversations that slowly reveal who someone is. And maybe that is how it usually happens. But with you, something felt different. It wasn't that we skipped the process. It was like we connected through something underneath the process, something harder to define, something that existed before all the details. The way we notice things, the way we process the world, the way we find meaning in moments other people overlook. That's where it happened. Not in the obvious places, in the small ones, in the pauses, in the things that were never said, because sometimes what someone doesn't say tells you more than what they do. And you understood that. You understood that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes silence is where the most honest things exist. That changed the way I experienced being around you, because I didn't feel pressure to constantly fill the space. I didn't feel like I had to perform. I didn't feel like I had to become a different version of myself to be accepted. I could just be. And being able to simply exist around someone is one of the rarest forms of comfort, because most connections require effort. They require adjustment. They require constantly managing how you are perceived. But this felt different. It felt natural. And that's what made it confusing. Because natural things are sometimes the hardest to explain. You can explain effort, you can explain intention, you can explain decisions. But how do you explain something that simply feels aligned? How do you explain why someone feels familiar when they shouldn't? How do you explain why a person can feel close without years of history? That was the question I kept returning to. Not because I doubted it, because I was trying to understand why something so unexpected felt so clear. And clarity can be unsettling, especially when you are someone who is used to analyzing everything. I've always trusted understanding. If I can understand something, I can handle it. If I can define it, I can place it. If I can place it, I can control how much space it takes. But this didn't follow those rules. It didn't arrive through logic. It didn't ask permission. It simply became part of my awareness. And once something becomes part of your awareness, pretending it isn't there becomes impossible. That was the shift. Not that you became important suddenly, but that I realized you had already become important quietly, without a moment I could point to, without a specific event, without a clear beginning. You were simply there. And somehow that mattered. I noticed myself thinking differently, not because I was trying to, because some part of me had started considering your perspective automatically. A thought would appear, and somewhere in the background was this awareness, a second viewpoint, a silent conversation, a feeling that certain things made more sense because they could be understood from your side too. And that was strange, because I've always been independent in my own mind. My thoughts have always been my own space, a place where I process everything privately. But somehow, you became part of that space, not by entering, by belonging. And that distinction matters, because forcing your way into someone's world creates resistance. But belonging creates acceptance. You didn't take anything from my world. You simply became part of it. And maybe that's why this feels different, because there was never a fight between keeping my distance and allowing closeness. There was no battle, no struggle. It just happened slowly, quickly, naturally, and now I find myself standing in a place I never expected to reach, a place where I have to admit something. You changed something, not everything, not who I am, but something. You changed the way I experience connection. You reminded me that being understood doesn't always require explaining every part of yourself. Sometimes it requires meeting someone who notices what others overlook, someone who doesn't just hear your words, someone who understands the space around them, and that is rare. That is why this matters. Because the world is full of people who can be around you. Far fewer people can truly meet you where you are, and somehow that's where you found me, not where I pretend to be, not where I make things easier for others, but where I actually exist, the part of me that doesn't always speak, the part that observes, the part that thinks before reacting, the part that has spent years building walls, not because I wanted to hide, but because I wanted to protect something real. And somehow, you never made those walls feel like a challenge. You never tried to climb over them. You simply showed me they didn't need to be there all the time. That realization changed more than I expected. Because sometimes the strongest connections are not the ones that demand your attention. They are the ones that quietly become impossible to ignore. And that is what happened. You became impossible to ignore, not because you demanded anything, because your presence created something I couldn't dismiss, a feeling of understanding, a feeling of alignment, a feeling that maybe some people are not meant to be explained immediately, maybe they are meant to be experienced. And maybe that is what this is. Not something perfect, not something that has all the answers, just something real, something that exists, something that changed the way I look at connection. And maybe the most unexpected part is this. I never planned for it. I never searched for it. I never tried to create it. But somehow, it found a place. And once something finds a place inside you, you don't forget that it was there. I think the hardest part about something like this is not discovering it. It's accepting that it exists. Because discovery gives you distance. You can observe something when you first notice it. You can study it. You can analyze it. You can convince yourself that you're simply trying to understand what is happening, but the acceptance is different. Acceptance means admitting that something has already changed. And I think that's where I found myself, not at the beginning of something new, but at the realization that something had already been happening quietly for longer than I wanted to admit. You became part of my awareness before I consciously allowed you to. That is the part I couldn't explain because I'm used to choosing what matters, choosing what deserves attention, choosing what gets close enough to affect me. I have always believed that control comes from awareness. If I know something is happening, I can decide what to do with it. But what happens when something reaches you before you even recognize the moment it arrived? What happens when something becomes important before you have the chance to decide whether it should? That was the strange part. You didn't enter my life loudly. You didn't create a moment that demanded attention. You became part of the quiet, and somehow that was stronger, because loud things can be ignored. Silence is harder. Silence stays. It waits, it reminds you, and with you, there was always that feeling, not pressure, not expectation, just presence. A kind of presence that didn't ask me to become someone else. And maybe that is why it reached deeper than anything else. Because I've spent a long time understanding how people see me, the version they create, the assumptions they make, the conclusions they reach after seeing only a fraction of who I am. People are often comfortable with incomplete versions of others. They take small pieces and build entire stories. They decide who someone is before they truly know. But you never seemed interested in creating a story about me. You paid attention to the reality. And there is something powerful about being seen without being rewritten. That is rare, because being seen is not always about someone noticing you. Sometimes it is about someone not changing what they notice. And you didn't take pieces of me and rearrange them into something easier. You didn't create an image of me that fit what you wanted. You simply allowed me to exist, and that created a different kind of trust. Not the kind built through promises, the kind built through consistency, through small moments, through the feeling that you don't have to defend every part of yourself. That feeling stayed. And the more it stayed, the more I realized something. Maybe the reason this felt unusual wasn't because it was impossible. Maybe it felt unusual because I wasn't used to something being this simple. So many connections are complicated. People searching for something, people expecting something, people needing something. But this felt different. It wasn't about taking. It wasn't about filling a gap. It was about recognizing something that was already there. And that's what made it difficult to categorize, because categories create distance. They make things easier to understand. But some connections exist before the labels, before the definitions, before you decide what something should be. They simply exist. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is acknowledge that, not force it, not control it, not destroy it by trying to explain every detail. Just allow it to be what it is. That was something I had to learn, because my instinct has always been to understand first, to analyze, to find the reason behind the feeling. But maybe not everything meaningful arrives with a clear explanation. Maybe some things arrive as a reminder that not everything valuable can be measured, not everything important can be predicted, not everything real follows a pattern you already understand. You made me realize that, not by telling me, by existing. And that might be the strongest kind of influence, the kind that doesn't force change, the kind that quietly creates space for it. I started noticing the difference between being alone and feeling alone. Before you, I thought those two things were almost the same. I was comfortable with my own space, comfortable with my own thoughts, comfortable carrying everything internally. But then I realized something. Being independent doesn't mean you never want someone to understand you. It means you rarely find someone who can. And when you do, you notice. You notice because it feels different. Because suddenly, the things you thought you had to carry alone don't feel as heavy. Not because someone takes them away, because someone finally understands why they exist. And that is a completely different kind of comfort, a deeper one, a quieter one, the kind that doesn't need constant reassurance, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself every day. It simply remains. And maybe that's what surprised me most. The fact that nothing about this needed to be forced. There was no chase, no performance, no attempt to create something that wasn't there. It was just two people meeting in a place where understanding came naturally. And natural things have their own rhythm. They don't need to be pushed. They don't need to be explained every second. They just move. And that movement changed something in me. I became more aware, more open. Not because I became someone different, because I stopped feeling the need to hide every part of myself. There is a difference between privacy and distance. Privacy protects you. Distance separates you. And somehow, with you, I learned that maybe I could protect myself without always being far away. Maybe I could let someone see more without losing anything. Maybe being understood doesn't make you weaker. maybe it makes you more complete. That was a difficult realization, because I spent so much time believing that being unreadable was strength, and maybe sometimes it is. Sometimes protecting yourself is necessary. But there is also strength in allowing the right person to understand you. Not everyone deserves access. But when someone proves they can hold what they see, keeping the door closed forever starts to feel less like protection and more like a limitation. That is what changed. You didn't break through anything. You didn't force your way in. You simply made me question why I was keeping everything locked. And that question stayed. Because some questions don't disappear, they become part of you. They follow you into quiet moments. They appear when you least expect them. And this one kept returning. What if this is not something to protect myself from? What if this is something to allow? And maybe that is where the real change began. Not when I noticed you. Not when I understood the connection. But when I stopped fighting the possibility that it mattered. Because the truth is, some people enter your life and leave memories. Some leave lessons, and some leave a different way of seeing, a different way of understanding, a different awareness of what connection can actually feel like. And that is what you became, not a distraction, not an escape, a reflection, a reminder that even the most guarded parts of a person can recognize something familiar. Even the strongest walls can recognize when they no longer need to be as high. And maybe that is the thing I keep coming back to. Not how unusual this feels, not how unexpected it was, but how peaceful it became. Because something that truly belongs doesn't always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly, and the quietest things are often the ones that stay the longest.